so much, Bonnie. Next up, we have Public Health Professor Han Kim on climate change and health. Han Kim has been a professor at Westminster for 12 years. After getting his undergraduate degree at the University of Michigan in engineering, he pursued a doctoral degree in epidemiology from the University of Washington. He teaches in the undergraduate and graduate public health programs, as well as in the Honors College. His public health interests include the social determinants of health, the impacts of social justice on health systems, and convincing pre-med students to study public health instead of biology. Sorry, Bonnie. Here is Han Kim.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to take it a little bit global this time. I think Bonnie did a great job of kind of looking at the local effects of climate change. I'm going to go take it a little bit global. I'm a little bit shocked. I'm usually the one that talks about poop, and Bonnie already talked about it. So I don't know what to talk about. But anyways, I think I'll find something. Recently, The Lancet published Lancet is a big medical journal. They published an issue on climate change and health. And all the big shots of public health and atmospheric sciences got together, and their statement was that global climate change is probably the biggest public health crisis in history. And that might sound like hyperbole, but most of us think that's true. This is an existential crisis in terms of health. And what's really insidious about this is that how global climate change affects health in ways that you wouldn't even expect. It has its tentacles in just about every aspect of health. And I'm going to try to kind of cover that in the next 10 minutes. I divide up the effects of global climate change on health into two aspects, direct and indirect. So the direct effects are literally the heat itself. And you're thinking, well, what is a few degrees Celsius increase going to do about health, right? I mean, we deal with temperature changes all the time. Well, here's the problem. We're getting a lot more heat waves. We call them extreme heat events. There's no real definition of them, but we're getting a lot more of them. You probably notice. During these heat waves, we have significant increases in mortality. Okay? It's hard to measure this because it's not like the bodies are filling the streets. It's just deaths. It's quiet deaths. People living in an apartment by themselves without air conditioning, dying just ones and twos. And oftentimes we don't identify those deaths as heat-related deaths because they resemble other forms of death. So we don't really have a good idea of how many people die because of direct effects of health. We do know that there is an increase. It's just, unfortunately, the way epidemiology is right now, it's really hard to measure that. But it is happening. We're getting more and more of these events. You hear about heat events in Europe, in US. And I'm glad that social justice was mentioned because this is going to be a theme that I'm going to be talking about. The people that get most affected by this are people from historically oppressed peoples. And I want to add further, these are typically people who contributed the least amount of carbon into the environment as well. So that's a serious justice issue. And that's going to be a theme that I'm going to touch on when I talk about the global impacts of climate change. So this is just, throughout time, how many hotter days we have in Houston. And in cities, this is exacerbated because cities are huge heat sinks. Okay? It can be sometimes 10, 15 degrees hotter in cities. And of course, the hottest parts of any city are going to be neighborhoods with low socioeconomic status people because of lack of trees, lots of concrete, parking lots, tends to absorb heat. It's much, much hotter. This is a worst case projection. This is a heat index of 100, the number of days that we're going to experience days with a heat index of 100. Heat index is a combination of heat and humidity. That's why Utah doesn't seem to be as highly affected because we don't have the humidity that, say, the Southeast does. And that is, the top one up there is historic from 1970 to about 1990. That is mid-century if we do nothing, if we keep the current levels of CO2 growth, and then that is the end of the century. So we're talking about some significant heat events. So the heat itself is going to affect people. And not just through, say, heat exhaustion and heat stroke, but increases in early, for example, there's studies that show that heat events are strongly associated with early labor. And so low birth weight babies. So maternal mortality and infant mortality. So it affects health in very, very insidious ways. This is in Iran. A few years ago, they hit a record, 165. That was the heat index. Combination of temperature and humidity. It's right at the edge of the Persian Gulf. Now, that 165, though, is a kind of a funny number because here's the NOAA's measure of heat index. And it's hard to read, but that number doesn't even exist. It's off the charts. And that's another theme. I'm going to talk about off the charts. And it is really, really scary. Okay? So, these places, the Middle East in particular, I don't know if you've heard, Qatar is going to be hosting the World Cup in the summer, which is a brilliant idea, right? Brilliant. So what did they do to one of the stadiums? They air conditioned it. It's an outdoor stadium, they air condition it. Now, obviously, most countries don't, and of course, they do that by burning more oil, contributing more to global climate change. But they can do that because they're wealthy. But the rest of the world can't do that. Okay? And so they're projecting that parts of the Middle East are going to be uninhabitable in the next few decades. I mean, literally, you can't live in there because it's too hot. Now, that's going to contribute, I'm going to talk about how this contributes to some health issues as well. Another direct way that climate change affects health is through the spread of infectious diseases, particularly vector-borne diseases. Even slight changes in global temperature will change the range of vectors. For example, the Anopheles mosquito and malaria. We're already seeing evidence of this. We have Florida, because it's always Florida, we have dengue transmission native to Florida. Dengue was eradicated from the US. We now have dengue fever, which is transmitted by the mosquito. Chikungunya. We just identified Chagas disease, which is a disease typical of Latin America. No one's gotten it yet, but we've identified the vectors that has having Chagas disease. So this is already happening, and this is just a list of diseases and the potential for spread. So malaria, schistosomiasis, which is spread by snails, filariasis, which is spread by mosquitoes, onchocerciasis, river blindness, dengue, yellow fever. Those all have a potential to spread, possibly into areas in the developed world where these diseases were eradicated centuries ago. It's not just vector-borne diseases either. Cholera, that is Vibrio cholerae. Cholera is an interesting one. It lives in brackish waters. It's a tough bugger. It survives in brackish waters in the tropics. And there's some evidence that the range of cholera is starting to spread. Could it spread to the US? Well, it's in Mexico. So very possibly could work its way up the Gulf Coast, and we could have cholera outbreaks. Luckily, we have a very robust sanitation system for the most part, and we should be okay, but that's definitely a fear. Now, another way, so those are the direct ways. The indirect ways are even more dangerous, okay? So you might not think of some of these issues as linked to global health, but it is. For example, food yields. Food yields, they're projecting 6 to 12% decline in food yields. Now, that might not seem like a lot. You can pay a little bit more at Whole Foods, and you're fine with it. However, the 2 to 3 billion people who are this close to poverty, who barely have enough to eat, it's going to affect them dramatically. Okay, so that's a serious issue. Again, people who suffer the most, the people who contributed least to the problem, including many, many, many children. Not only food, but water. Water's a big one. This is water stress. You heard about the term day zero. That's a new one, right? Cape Town almost had day zero. That's the day they run out of water. That's a scary concept, okay? Recently, Chennai in India experienced that as well. I showed this map because this is where about 2.5 to 3 billion people live. All get water from the Himalayas. Glaciers that are shrinking. What happens when those glaciers shrink? This is food for thought. This is a overhead. This group has been doing projects looking at different reservoirs in different parts of the world. This is a reservoir in Morocco, and they did satellite imagery for several years, and this is what's happening. And they've looked at several other reservoirs. They're all shrinking. And so, we're at the point where we're not going to be fighting wars over oil. We're going to be fighting wars over water. Air pollution is another indirect way that climate change is exacerbating. Bonnie mentioned it briefly. As drought occurs, we're going to have dust being kicked up. And that dust typically has heavy metals, PM10s, PM2.5s. Right now, you can see that number 5 risk factors for total number of deaths is air pollution. Estimates anywhere from 1 to 10 to 1 to 20 people in China die because of air pollution. This is something that we know about, of course, because it's inversion season. Now, this is a horrible picture because it's supposed to be a horrible picture. That's Delhi. I don't know if you've heard about New Delhi. Their AQI, we don't know what their AQI is. Now, our AQI on a really bad day is probably about 250, 300, okay? And those are the days that's just horrible, right? You taste it and you're staying inside. The maximum measuring tool in New Delhi measures the maximum of 999. It got pegged. We have no idea what the AQI is here. And it's been going on for weeks. Okay? So how is air pollution associated? Well, number one, heat actually, ground ozone pollution is generated by heat. Okay? That's one way. Another way is, again, drought exacerbated by heat increases dust. Okay? And of course, the burning of fuels that contribute to CO2 also contributes to a whole lot of other pollution. This is an interesting one, and this is one I discovered recently. Allergies. I know this doesn't seem like a big deal. You sneeze a little bit, you buy some Kleenexes, but as climate changes, we're going to have more pollen in the air, more allergies. By the way, allergies and asthma do lead to significant disease burden as well, and people do die of asthma attacks. So it's not something to disregard. Like I said, it's this insidious, the different ways that climate change affects all aspects of health. Storms, increased storms. We've all noticed. There seems to be a lot of Cat 5 hurricanes nowadays. Right? This is a few years ago. That's Maria in the center, Kasia over by Mexico, and that's Jose out to sea. That was an extraordinary picture. 3 hurricanes in the North Atlantic at the same time, all lined up. We're going to see more of this. As the temperatures of the ocean rise, that of course feeds hurricanes. The intensity of hurricanes are going to increase. And also, they're just becoming wetter. I think which was Hurricane Harvey just sat on top of Houston and just dumped water. That was unbelievable. That was wild. That was really, really disturbing. The winds weren't the issue. It just kept dumping water. Just fed water off the Gulf Coast and just dumped it on Houston. We're going to see more of those storms. We're seeing these storms stall over land and just dump water. And this is going to cause a lot of issues as well from a health standpoint. This is just to show that this is what's going on. Hurricane category strength is increasing. We seem to be getting more. We don't even hear about all the typhoons and cyclones in the Pacific. There's been several huge ones, really unusually huge ones. Sea levels are going to rise. We haven't even mentioned that yet. Sea levels will rise. And again, who are going to be most affected? People who contributed the least. This is Bangladesh. Most of Bangladesh is at or below sea level. Also, most of the fertile farmland is in that delta, which is now the salinity is increasing, and therefore it's not farmable, which affects food production. It also affects migration, which I'll talk about in a second. And of course, we have the Pacific Islands. They've contributed almost nothing to carbon. They have almost zero carbon footprint. Yet, they have, as countries, evacuation plans to evacuate the entire country. So, and what's sad is, a lot of these countries do need our help, but funders are very reluctant to build any sort of infrastructure on an island that may disappear in the next few decades. It's a double whammy. And again, the social justice issue is serious here. One of the other theme to this is cycles and feedback loops and how these are all interconnected. Every single factor I talked about are all interconnected, right? For example, this is a study, and in fact, this is a study done that links the Syrian conflict, which cost millions of lives, incredible suffering and pain, has been indirectly linked to climate change. Climate change has forced farmers to move into cities. Whenever you have migration and population dislocations, you have conflict. we're entering the days of climate refugees now. And just given the rhetoric now about the anti-immigration rhetoric now, imagine if the refugees increase by exponentially. What's going to happen? So this is to me the scariest part, is how climate change can cycle into human conflict. Water wars. Will countries be fighting for water? The Mekong River feeds multiple countries in Southeast Asia. What if China decides to dam it? What will Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand do? Right? Same with Africa. What if Sudan decides to dam the Nile? So this is this is probably the scariest part, and the part that people think about the least. Even the Pentagon, the bleeding hearts at the Pentagon, have determined that global climate change is a serious security issue and that they need to plan for it, that we will have conflict and war due to climate change. So, how do I end this on a good note? Because that was pretty depressing. I mean, it really was. I guess, we have cycles, and we often talk about these feedback loops, these negative feedback loops, but there can be positive feedback loops as well. All right? There can be. I really do believe that. I don't think it's too late to change these issues. We have the wherewithal, we have the technology to change the way we produce energy, to implement family planning, to reduce population sizes, to increase migration, to start moving people to where they want to be and where they're needed the most. I think these are possible, and they can mitigate many of the very serious problems that I mentioned. So, thank you.